So I'm going to go ahead and go back to PowerPoint now so I can make some nice pretty graphs instead of drawing them by hand. Two little example questions here. So drawing on some real world data. So in September 2010, if we looked at the data, there were 238 million people in the adult civilian non-institutionalized population. Of those, 139 million were employed according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition, and 15 million of them were unemployed according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition. So what is the unemployment rate in this situation here? Sorry, excuse me, this question is what is the labor force participation rate? I was getting ahead of myself. So what we want to do here is remember that the labor force is all of the employed plus all of the unemployed. So we're going to go ahead and make a fraction. On the top of that fraction, we're going to have 139 plus 1 plus 15. And then on the bottom of the fraction is going to be the adult civilian non-institutionalized population, or 238. So we should have 139 plus 15 gets us to 154, I think, over 238. And if I remember right, the labor force participation rate is sort of in this interval here. For the unemployment rate, we're going to look at the unemployed compared to the entire labor force. So 15 million people is going to be on the top of our fraction. On the bottom of our fraction is the total labor force, which is all of the employed plus all of the unemployed. So we would have 15 million over 15 plus 139, and I believe that gets us to 10.8%. Now, let's go ahead and look at the evolution of these things over time. So we have two things in here. The labor force participation rate we've already talked about here. So that measures how many people are willing and able to work. They might not have a job, but they want one, or they already do have one. Another thing that sometimes people look at here is the employment population ratio. So this is the ratio of all the employed over the entire adult civilian non-institutionalized population. So this kind of folds together some information about both labor force participation and the unemployment rate. Really, if you have both labor force participation and the unemployment rate, you can estimate this one, so it's a little bit redundant, but sometimes people like to look at it. And you can see here that, sort of interestingly perhaps, both of these started trending down, or sort of peaked in the late 1990s, and then started trending down and trending down. And that's mostly, the sort of general trend is mostly due to people staying in school longer and people actually retiring somewhat earlier. But then particularly right here at the end, we get some accelerated decline and a fall and sort of not much recovery that's due to recession. So some people drop out of the labor force entirely after the recession. If we look at the unemployment rate over time, we can see that, yeah, it's definitely swung around a little bit. Notice that this graph is a little tiny bit misleading, maybe because it doesn't go all the way down to zero. But the shaded regions are regions of recessions, and we can see that the unemployment rate rises during recessions. No surprise there. And, you know, while the news media are prone to a lot of hyperbole about, oh, whatever's happening right now is the worst or best thing ever, it is true that this most recent recession we had here is, definitely up there. Maybe not the worst recession since the end of World War II. That would depend exactly how we measure it, but certainly pretty darn close, if not the worst. Worth noticing that, of course, different people have different average unemployment rates. If we go out there and look, we would see that on average, unemployment rates among African Americans are higher than those among whites, and we would see that unemployment rates are different by education, and that's exactly what we're seeing in this slide. And no surprise here, when you have less education, you experience a higher unemployment rate. Notice that, unemployment rates rose for everybody during the recession, and we sort of heard a lot on the news about people graduating from college, not being able to get jobs, so on and so forth. But if you sort of look at it here, as bad as things might have gotten, the unemployment rate among college graduates at the worst of it was lower than the normal unemployment rate, even in the best of times, for high school dropouts. And so I think, yes, it might be true that college graduates had trouble finding work, but it's still also true that, the unemployment rate among college graduates was about a third or a quarter what it was among high school dropouts. And even you can see, sort of comparing this to people who just have 2 years of college, the unemployment rate for people with 4 years of college is about half of what it is for people with 2 years of college. Little sideline from unemployment exactly. Of course, education not only influences your ability to get a job, it also influences the amount of money that you make when you get a job. And not surprisingly, we see that higher levels of education tend to be related to higher levels of pay. What I do want to focus on, because pretty much everybody probably knows that, is there's a lot of diversity hidden in those numbers. So the community college system has this nice little website with the title here, salarysurfer.ccccco.edu up at the top. And it sort of looks at what's your income by major. So this is, what are people's income 5 years after graduating community college? And even within things that would broadly be counted as business, accounting, economics, marketing, you can see there's a significant spread in the amount of money that people make. Or if we were to look at, art and drama majors versus other majors, sort of not a surprise again. I think everybody knows that you are probably not likely to strike it rich if you major in art or drama, but I think it's really sort of surprising that if you think about this, of course, someone who's working 2,000 hours a year for minimum wage of $8 an hour would have income of $16,000. So drama majors are sort of not even quite reaching that full-time employment and a minimum wage job level of income. Art majors, if you sort of divide this all out to be 2,000 hours a year, they're making about $12.50 an hour. Electricians are making about $30 an hour. Nurses are making almost $40 an hour. And you can sort of estimate, if you divide these by 2,000, what the different wages are. But again, my point here is it's not just that going to college gets you higher income. It really depends on what you major in. And one of the things that is actually probably a problem in our economy is that people are actually increasingly choosing to major in things that don't have a high wage level associated with them. So generally we see high wage levels associated with people who are either having good hands-on technical skills, they're going to have things like science, math, and engineering, healthcare, and you notice that even within the field of business, sort of the more you work with numbers, the higher the income that we see here. Marketing is probably less number intensive than accounting. And accounting, you're definitely working with numbers, but as far as actual math, it might be that economics is a little bit more mathy than accounting even. Going back and thinking then about recessions and so on, our most recent recession, this red line shows what has happened with job losses. And of course, job losses, again, aren't exactly the same thing as unemployment, because some people have 2 jobs and so on and so forth. But sort of people who say that the most recent recession is unusually severe are totally right here. You can see that, at its worst, our recession was about half, again, as bad maybe as the recession after the end of World War II. Also notice something else in this graph, is that the shape of recessions has changed over time. If you look at these recessions for 1948 and 1953, they're what we sometimes call a V-shaped recession, a very sharp decline and then a relatively fast recovery. But then if we look at these later recessions as we go on, the recessions become a little more U-shaped. In particular, let me think about 1990 and 2001. You can see that while the job losses were not as severe, the recovery process was also more prolonged. Probably a lot of this has to do with the shift from manufacturing to services somewhat. So immediately after World War II, more people were employed in manufacturing, and it may be that firms are more likely to temporarily lay off workers until they work through their back inventory, if you have a heavily manufacturing-based economy, and then quickly rehire them once the inventory has been sold off. Whereas in a more service-based economy, firms may be slower to lay people off and also slower to rehire them because there's not sort of this issue of managing inventory. Notice that our latest recession has the wonderful feature of being even more severe than these post-World War II recessions, and the recovery looks like it will be as prolonged as our more recent 1990 or 2001 recessions. If you sort of extrapolate this out, it looks like maybe in another 24 months or so, we'll have regained all the jobs that we had right before the recession started. So obviously that's a really long time, but then again, it was also it was a very steep decline, and you want to keep in perspective that generally speaking, more recent recessions in 1990, 2001 have had this feature of a very long, drawn-out recovery process. We actually have a good estimate of the relationship between GDP growth and changes in unemployment. So when GDP grows, of course, firms are producing more, and as firms produce more, they're more likely to hire people and reduce unemployment. So every one of these blue diamonds on here represents a quarter, a 3-month period here. And we can see that there's definitely a relationship between fast GDP growth and a decline in the unemployment rate. So fast GDP growth puts us on the right here. If we have a decline in unemployment, which is a good thing, then we're lower down here. The red line here traces the average relationship, and we can see that generally speaking, the coefficients here are positive here, that a higher rate of GDP growth reduces unemployment faster. One thing to think about here is that we can therefore take an estimate of, if the economy is growing at 3% per year, what does that mean for changes in the unemployment rate? Or if we wanted the unemployment rate to go down by, say, 0.5% per economic quarter, which would be huge. That means we'd be dropping the unemployment rate 1% per year. Then we would need to see the unemployment rate, we would need to see the economy grow by about 14%. So that's really, really fast, and the economy almost never grows that fast. There have been a few cases. So this is what's called Okun's law, this relationship between changes in the GDP or the GDP growth rate and unemployment. One question that's sort of out there being debated among economists is whether or not structural unemployment has risen. So unemployment seems to have been unusually persistent in our most recent recession. And in particular, one thing that we notice is that usually there's a kind of fairly predictable relationship between the unemployment rate and what's called the vacancy rate. What percentage or what fraction of job openings are vacant? And in general, what we see here is that when we have a high unemployment rate, the vacancy rate is low, because when there's a high unemployment rate, there are lots of workers out there looking for work, and employers have an easy time filling the jobs. And this blue section here maps out the historical relationship for the normal historical relationship before our most recent recession between the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate. And what happened in our most recent recession here is that maybe some of these data points look consistent with our earlier line, but then we have some data points out here that really look not very consistent, where we're seeing that, geez, the unemployment rate's really high, and employers are apparently having a hard time filling the jobs because the vacancy rate, employers are having a relatively easy time filling these jobs. And so we sort of think here that maybe the structural unemployment rate has risen. That's something that's much debated, and I actually have a little bit of data. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is this big sort of multi-country think tank that studies what's going on in the more developed countries in the world out there. And they have done some estimates of what the natural rate of unemployment is for different countries out there. So two things we want to see here. One is the natural rate of unemployment is not constant. And the reason for that could be things like changing skill levels. We know that people with higher levels of education generally have lower rates of unemployment. So if the average skill level in the economy goes up, we would predict that the unemployment rate would go down. Or changes in things like demographics. We know that people, say for instance in their 40s, have lower unemployment rates than people in their 20s because they've mostly found a career and a job and they're sticking with it and not sort of moving from place to place. So in a population where a higher fraction of the labor force is relatively young, we're going to have a higher unemployment rate. So you can see sort of the darkest blue line here is the natural rate of unemployment. Let me go ahead and try and zoom in here. Make this all a little bit more visible. Okay, so you can see Australia, the OECD estimates that, the unemployment rate is sort of natural rate of unemployment. This new update has sort of swung around a little bit. And, maybe it's gotten as high as 8%, and now they think it's eyeballing it around 6%. Notice that different countries, so Canada, our neighbors to the north here, notice that they have, a relatively high estimate, at least in the late 80s, of what the natural rate of unemployment is. Or we could go over here and we could see information for Germany or the Czech Republic, Spain, Denmark. Okay, let's look at Spain here. So, of course, different countries have different labor market institutions. They have different laws and regulations. They have, strong unions or weak unions. They have even different cultures. So, maybe in some cultures it's deeply shameful to be out of work, and other cultures not so much. So some countries we notice tend to really have much higher unemployment than others. I'm going to pick on Spain here, and you can see that, this blue dotted line is the actual historical unemployment rate in Spain. And sort of Spain went through an economic boom right before the financial crisis. But notice their economic boom only caused their unemployment rate to get down to 8%. Whereas, 8% is, by U.S. standards, a pretty, nasty recession. And then, their normal background level of unemployment, the sort of estimate of that NAIRU, how low we could push unemployment without pushing inflation up, you can see here that, these researchers think that the natural rate of unemployment for Spain is kind of like in the 12-14% range. Because again, the natural rate of unemployment depends upon things like culture and labor market institutions. Or we could sort of pick on France here. In France, the natural rate of unemployment is maybe 8%, 9%, I can't quite see there, because essentially different countries set their economies up to run differently. So their estimate for the United States should be around here somewhere. Oh, let me go to Japan. So Japan has typically had a very low level of unemployment. It has gone through some recessions, but notice, Japan went through a recession, and the highest its unemployment rate got was like almost to 6%. And that's like a normal level of unemployment for the U.S. economy. So again, we want to remember that although the natural rate of unemployment, the word natural is in that, you don't want to overread that. It's not natural like gravity is natural and it's fixed and constant throughout the universe. It's not sort of like handed down as a part of the structure of the universe. It's malleable and it responds to changes in culture and laws and so on and so forth. And it's also not natural in the sense that like it's groovy and good. It's a natural rate of unemployment, but it is something that we can do something about and hopefully reduce. All right, let me just see if we've got the U.S. We've got Mexico, Sweden. Okay, here we go, U.S. So you can see that the OECD researchers are estimating that the natural rate of unemployment in the U.S. is about 6%. And yeah, it has sort of changed slightly over time.